During my surgery, I felt myself lift from my body and go above the operating table. The doctor told me later that they had kept my heart open and stopped for a long time, and they had a great amount of difficulty getting my heart started again. It was so strange to be so detached from my physical body. I was curious about what they were doing, but not really concerned. Then, as I drifted farther away, I saw my father at the head of the table. He looked up at me, which did give me a surprise, because he had been dead now for almost a year. Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff and Joe the Scientist explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn and...
I'm Joe.
You'd think I would have memorized that by now.
Oh.
So what I did was I read a bunch of different stories of near-death experiences, and they were so affected or I don't know what the word is, but they were so much from the person's own perspective of their entire life, and religion played a big part in that it was hard to really get a handle on, is this just a religious experience? Or is this something that really happens? Or is it some physical thing that occurs in the brain when you've got, a lack of oxygen to your brain or something? So I went to the scientific studies. You would have been so proud of me. So a study conducted by Dr. Jeffrey Long, which was published on the National Institute of Health's website, concluded, and this is a quote, "Multiple lines of evidence point to the conclusion that near-death experiences are medically inexplicable and cannot be explained by known physical brain function." End quote. Let's go back and just define what a near-death experience is. First of all, they refer to it as an NDE, so I'm going to say NDE because it's a lot easier than saying near-death experience repeatedly. So it's a profound personal encounter that's associated with death or the imminent possibility of death.
But they're not dead.
But they're not dead. They're near dead because maybe their heart is stopped or whatever, but they have not put something on them to see that their brain functions.
So that means they're almost to the point where they're unrecoverable.
Right. That is actually a very good point because they bring that up. In the majority of cases, the encounters involve various sensations such as they feel detached from their physical body, or they feel like they're floating. They have a sense of peace. They might feel security and warmth, overwhelming joy, and a sense of absolute dissolution. They reflect on significant life events, and lots of people say they encounter a radiant light or visions of deceased relatives.
And as I understand it, that's like more common than not.
Yeah.
Right? It's typically the case that people have very good experiences.
Yes. And it's across all religions and no religion. It's across everybody. So it doesn't matter if they're religious or not. The religion part comes in when they identify that light as being God.
Yeah.
Or that
they start attaching meaning to
right, or the dead people they say are angels. Then you see that influence of their religion.
But there's definitely a very typical way it goes.
Yeah, but the negative effects, and some people do have negative experiences, might be anguish, distress. They encounter a void. They experience devastation. Their perception is that it's a vast emptiness. They might see frightening imagery, such as hellish landscapes or entities, but that's not that common. The positive ones are more common. So
much more common.
Much more common. So NDEs typically manifest during periods of reversible clinical death. Reversible is the important part because you wouldn't know that they experienced if it was irreversible because they'd be dead.
We literally have no information from the irreversible cases because we couldn't reverse them.
Right. We can't ask those people if they're dead unless you can do a seance or talk on the Ouija board. The explanations for these things span the spectrum from scientific to religion. People interpret it lots of different ways. According to the neuroscience research, an NDE could be a subjective occurrence stemming from disruptive bodily multisensory integration. That was a mouthful. During a life-threatening situation. Some people say it's various spiritual and religious doctrines concerning the afterlife, which influence those descriptions. but nobody really knows. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you were a Christian during your lifetime, that if you have a near-death experience, you're going to have a religious experience, because lots of people that were Christians, identified as Christians, didn't have some kind of religious, profound experience where they saw Jesus. And conversely, the other way, there are some people who did not, or said they did not lead a religious life, and then they saw something that they perceived as being some supreme being. In the United States, an estimated 9 million people have reported that they experienced an NDE. That study was published in 2011 in the New York Academy of Sciences. Those near-death occurrences were mainly, what caused them to have a near-death experience were mainly from severe injuries that impacted their body or brain. Later on, this doctor identifies that most of the experiences that he studied were from heart attacks. And probably those two things would be because, first of all, they're reversible frequently. They're bad enough that they could put you into cardiac arrest. Well, in a heart attack, obviously, you're having a cardiac arrest, but you know what I mean? That they are going to be out of commission in what looks like you're dead, but it's reversible. So, a common feature of these experiences is out-of-body experience.
So you mean they're perceiving their body and they feel like they're external to their body? Yeah,
they perceive what's going on. They perceive ongoing events from a vantage point outside of their physical bodies. About 45% of NDEs report this.
It's interesting because I know there has been, I think it's like deep brain stimulation studies. So they like have a probe, or they use electrical currents or sound or something. There's various ways to do it, to stimulate parts of your brain. And there's like one section of your brain that if you stimulate it, you have that sense.
Oh, Rook talked about that.
There's another one that, another area of your brain where if you stimulate it, you have a profound experience.
Oh.
So it's kind of strange that all of these particular areas would be engaging simultaneously. Why?
Yeah.
They're just areas of your brain. They're responsible for doing certain things so you can exist as a person. They're not like, oh, we're going to be good for to the person and stimulate this great, awesome center of their brain while they're dying. No one is saying that. You didn't evolve. That has no bearing on your evolution at all, because that's the least, the part of your life that has nothing to do with reproduction.
Right.
You can't reproduce at that point.
It has no value in the scheme of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very interesting point that the researchers who have studied this have found. About 45% of NDEs report out-of-body experiences. And when they witness their own resuscitation from this detached perspective, the accuracy of those observations are more precise than a control group being asked what happened during your resuscitation. So they're much more accurate. They found that in 89 case reports of NDEs with OBEs, out-of-body experiences, 92% were entirely accurate. Entirely.
Wow.
They knew who was doing what, everything. Another investigation of 617 NDEs revealed 97.6% descriptions of their OBE experience to be realistic, with no inaccuracies.
Wow. I seem to recall hearing that, like, a meta-analysis of so like certain studies, they'd put something like in a corner of a room, you couldn't see it, and then they would, over time, they'd accumulate reports of near-death experiences, and they'd ask the people if they saw the thing. And if I remember right, the analysis of those studies, or that study, was that they just didn't get enough data, and the quality of the data wasn't very good. Like, it's complicated because if someone's having an NDE, they're near death.
Yeah.
It's a pretty significant. They're not like necessarily looking around the room and saying, "All right, remember this for the researchers."
Right.
They're dying literally.
Yeah.
And they just happen to not die because they're resuscitated. So.
Right. And so what they relate is their experience. They might not have been looking in the direction of the star that's pasted on the wall in the corner behind the cabinet.
So it's really hard to discern the case where they just don't see it because they're not paying attention to that. It's not a priority. And the case where they don't see it because they couldn't have got that information. Like it's entirely mental versus they're a ghost outside their body. How do you pry those two apart when the quality of the results are not very good? You know? I mean, presumably what could be one or the other, and you have to do something to detect which it is.
Right. The conventional explanations do not explain what is going on here. So you can't really do that. They said that even clinically comatose patients had these same experiences where they could see, this out-of-body experience where they could see things going on. All that to say that suggests that NDEs aren't merely products of anticipated death experiences, but something that's going on, some phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. This was really interesting. So they had the opportunity to study some people who were blind. In some cases, they were blind from birth. And you would think that they would have some experience where it was limited by what their experience of vision is. Since a lot of people who have NDEs, they describe what they see as being super normal vision, like everything's super bright or super beautiful. These blind people, they saw things that they'd never seen. They described things that they could not have known because they're blind and they've always been blind. So
what do you mean by they saw? Because blind people, typically the rest of their brain starts recycling their visual cortex for other things. So the concept of sight for somebody who literally has their visual cortex is not being used for sight at all is kind of hard. It'd be like saying, can you detect electrostatic fields or something? If you don't have the detectors for that information, the concept and what it even is, what it's like to perceive that has less meaning than, you know what I mean?
Right. So I read one of the descriptions that a blind person said of their near-death experience, and it was very detailed. And what they described was that they saw some beautiful people in the distance, and they described their clothing. Now, this is my own thoughts are this. Okay, well, if they're an adult, now obviously these are all adult people that they studied. No mention of children being studied at all. Although I'm sure they have studied children because children experience these same things. But this was an adult. They were blind from birth. Presumably, they've touched things to get a sense. I mean, that's how they see, air quotes, see. And so to say that there were beings in the distance, well, they know what a human being is shaped like. So what they're seeing is the shape of, what they've experienced. But there were some things that they said, now I can't remember because I didn't copy it down, unfortunately, where they described some things that sounded like bright lights and stuff, like maybe they were having some other experience.
So it's interesting because basically everything for people who cannot see is still there in their brain. So like, for instance, if you touch something, you're using the parts of your brain for essentially three-dimensional representation. If you are talking about colors, you still have you still are able to perceive colors in the sense that they are distinct things that qualify things. An apple is red. This person doesn't like green, and this object is green. There's still the concept of distance. like for instance, if you're having an out-of-body experience, but you can't see, you couldn't still sense how far that thing is away
Right.
from you. So it's kind of interesting because it kind of begs the question, what does the sight actually add to the equation when you can see it? What's it actually
Right.
adding?
But it is interesting that they described seeing and they had never seen before. And their understanding what they were experiencing was sight. So this would be super normal for them because they've never experienced whatever they were experiencing.
So, you know the thing, like how some people supposedly have super vivid imaginations, they can like almost hallucinate, whatever. How do you differentiate between someone who's imagining seeing something and like actually like exactly equivalent to seeing it with their eyes? Like there's information shunted in from a different spot than their literal eyes to their visual cortex.
I agree with you, but to go back to what you said before, there's no evolutionary reason why we would have these experiences at the moment of death. And there's no evolutionary reason why somebody who has been blind from birth would suddenly perceive that they're seeing. And if it was just misfiring of the brain, which is what some people have suggested, wouldn't there be other weird things that would go on?
Well, I think what I'm kind of proposing is it's not necessarily misfiring. It's everything working exactly as it should. It's just that your brain is so good at representing things internally that you can make the exact same representation, internal representation, by touching something as you can by seeing. So like the thing with imagination, you know, if you're really into what you're imagining, then are you seeing it? Well, the parts of your brain that are responsible for that are activated at the same time when you do see something are activated when you're imagining it. It's just there's a section necessarily that isn't activated. Like, for instance, everything from your eyes to your visual cortex can't be activated. But maybe some section within there, between your eyes and your visual cortex is activated in order to process vision, but it's also can be used for processing imagination. It's obviously a different thing. It's like dreaming. When you're dreaming, you are not seeing with your eyes, but probably nobody would say, yeah, it's not unlike seeing with your eyes, you know?
Yeah.
And so definitively, you are not seeing anything. You're blind when you're dreaming.
That's true.
But clearly you are seeing. As far as I know, it's been hotly debated for literally thousands of years what the actual difference in meaning of the difference between like actual seeing and versus, you know, imagining or perceiving something versus imagining perceiving something. In that case, that's really interesting how they are seeing something, but it's actually more like, are the sighted people even really seeing it?
Right. One more thing I'll say before I go into picking your brain. The author of one study reviewed 613 near-death experiences and found that 23 of them, only 23, appeared to have occurred while under general anesthesia. So that's interesting.
So most didn't?
Most did not. Cardiac arrest was the most common life-threatening event that was described in association with the occurrence of the near-death experiences. Okay, so what do you think is going on?
So, like I know of certain things, certain proposals, like for instance, your brain gets flooded with certain neurotransmitters or neurohormones or whatever because of the oxygen starvation. I know I've experienced weird stuff like if I stand up too quick, my blood pressure is too low, and so I don't get enough blood in my head, and so I'm very near to passing out. Oxygen starvation to some degree. And so sometimes there's strange perceptions, but the fact that they're always so, there's a typical form to them across cultures, as far as we can see.
That's what these studies show.
Indicates that either there's some other process that is encouraged. So I'm saying other as in like paranormal, something beyond your body, or there's an internal process that's producing it. And the internal process has obviously something to do with what has immediately happened to your body. So the oxygen thing, it's not always trauma. It could be, and I mean trauma like physical injury, or, you know, it's not shock. It's not a coma thing. It's, you know, like you can narrow it down pretty far. If you could not artificially reproduce those conditions in someone who is not dying, like via deep brain stimulation or whatever, safely, reproducibly, produce the exact same experience, then it would indicate it's something other than what's, you know, if you can do deep brain stimulation, you know it's those areas of your brain being stimulated. You have a causal model then for what's happening.
Okay, I have a couple things I want to say about that. Number one is they have done lots of studies on the brain where they have stimulated different parts of the brain, probably as many parts of the brain as they have identified as distinct, and none of them have produced this exact same thing.
The combination of
right.
So they have done deep brain stimulation and whatever lesion studies and whatever, where there are like parts of that same experience.
Yes, that's true. Like the out-of-body experience. The paranormal and Christian, and I'm going to put Christian in with paranormal.
It is
because
paranormal.
It is paranormal. So paranormal opinion is that you have a spirit, it rises out of your body, and this is what's going on. Presumably, during that resuscitation, where the person is near death, their heart may have stopped or whatever, they aren't just like laying there experiencing a lack of oxygen, because I've been at resuscitations. They're giving them oxygen, they're artificially producing circulation in their bodies. So this is not lack of oxygen to their brain. That you can take that out of the equation. That is not what's happening. So again, some stimulation to the brain. What would be inciting that stimulation to the brain, and what part of the brain? Because they haven't identified it so far. Paranormal people would say it's your spirit rising out of your body and you're going to meet God or whatever. And since I do believe in ghosts, or an afterlife, let me put it that way, I'm more likely to think that there's an influence of something of that realm involved in this.
So I should say, if you believe in ghosts or spirits, whatever, afterlife. The best bet 100% is that is the explanation. 100% that this, if you think, yes, high confidence, there's an afterlife, there's ghosts, whatever, then, well, ultimately, yes, high confidence, you are actually out of your body. Your near-death experience is almost always you detaching somehow. That's not like, oh, you know, just because it sounds kind of like a woo thing, that it can't be used then for predictive power or as a causal model. No, definitely. If you believe it, you should use it. And, you know, like ultimately, if there's any sort of afterlife, including things like reincarnation and things that are really exotic, that like things that include depersonalization, you are no longer you, essentially, then even then, it's a good bet that near-death experiences are that, or have something to do with that. So I guess really that is the distinguishing. If your world model includes anything where you can exist, you meaning your non-neurological consciousness can exist outside your body, then it's a really good bet that that's what's happening. So in the case of people who prescribe to simulation models, so you are essentially in a computer being simulated, there's other variants of that are much more exotic. and much more likely. But in the computer case, none of it would make any sense. There's no reason why you'd experience that. So, like VR, a future game, you live an entire life in VR. There might be a point then to why you would
see something beyond
want that experience,
Yeah. Some common characteristics of near-death experiences are a sense of awareness of being dead. Also, a sense of peace or well-being, painlessness, and other positive emotions. Maybe you feel removed from the world, an intense feeling of unconditional love. You may feel euphoric. And an out-of-body experience, quite often from an outside position, observing medical professionals or other people around your body. The tunnel experience is very common. You enter a darkness towards a light, a sense of moving up or through a passageway or staircase, rapid movement towards this beautiful, powerful light. Some people say it's God, some people say it's Jesus, some people just say it's just a bright light. Another one is being reunited with deceased loved ones. The old saying, you see your life flash before you. Receiving a life review is something that a lot of people also describe. And then approaching a border or a decision to return or continue. And oftentimes these people say they're reluctant to return, then they suddenly find themselves back in their body. A connection to the cultural beliefs held by the individuals seem to dictate some of the phenomena experienced, but really after the fact is when they start applying some of those religious or cultural things to those experiences.
It's like false memories. They are interpreting it.
Exactly. Our contact information is in the show notes. You can email us, text us, or even call and leave a 3-minute voicemail. And as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.
Dun dun.